Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm really thrilled to be here and to give this talk that really comprises of excerpts from my book, my first book, and because I think in many ways it intersects wonderfully with the exhibition. But before I begin the talk, I would first like to thank the curatorial team for inviting me, particularly Dr. Sean Christian, the professor of English at FIU. But I also would like to thank Sasha Lamadrid and Luna Goldberg of the Wilsonian for making all of this possible. Okay, so this talk, it seeks to illuminate the imaginative ways in which Black visual artists and performers of the Caribbean and the United States sought to create art that epitomized their respective milieus in the early 20th century. It is gleaned from my book, Tropical Aesthetics of Black Modernism, which contemplates in great depth on how early 20th century Caribbean and American artists responded to oppressive regimes through visual and corporeal expressions of tropicality. Moreover, this project privileges the land and reveals how Black diasporic artists recognize that a sense of place is critical to their creative processes, as well as in the identity formation of early 20th century Black people. While this book offers ideas about Black modernism that are new to the discipline of art history in particular, it is important to acknowledge its address to studies of Black modernity more broadly. By proposing an alternative understanding of the tropics, this talk shows how Aaron Douglas and Josephine Baker effectively contributed to the development of Black modernity and even Black sonic modernity. My theoretical intervention demonstrates how tropicality calls for a new understanding of the African diasporic experience, a unifying element connecting the Black Atlantic that is not generic, but creates a linkage between this enclave and the land of origin, Africa. This notion of tropicality thus disrupts the construction of Africa as the antithesis of Europe and the embodiment of the past, and renders the Pan-African world as a purposeful interlocutor of modern life. This project grapples with the ways in which visual tropes of tropicality complicated the conveyance of modernity for Black people in different locations throughout the Black Atlantic. It examines the creative manifestations of Black modernism in the early 20th century and explicates how tropicality functioned as a key unifying element in African diasporic art. By examining the works of Douglas and Baker in this talk, I will explain how their representations of tropical and subtropical landscapes are reflective of the unique yet complex relationship that Black people of these respective regions have with the terrain they inhabit, land on which many of the enslaved ancestors labored. Despite this traumatic legacy, these creative works nonetheless show how this land is revered by its inhabitants, who recognize it for its beauty, with the intention not to transform it, but to accept it. This ideological heeding to nature should be viewed as an alternative modernity that counters the idea of transforming undeveloped nature for the sake of capitalist expansion. In so doing, there is a particular political enterprise at stake, one that dissociates the land with the history of slavery and thereby reclaims it. Artists such as Douglas and Baker are thus highlighting the internationalist ethos of Pan-Africanism through their visual and performed explorations of landscapes, terrains that are mostly tropical, and are therefore geopolitically uniting areas such as the southern United States and the Caribbean. Ultimately, this talk seeks to illuminate the desire for early 20th century Black Atlantic peoples to engender a sense of belonging to the citizenry and a particular kind of claim to the land that they inhabit, which speaks to a desire for home. In The Problem of Nature, David Arnold asserts that tropicality is a form of othering that encapsulates an ambivalent body of ideas, representations, and experiences, all of which exist in a mental juxtaposition to something else. Or, simply stated, tropicality is a social construction rather than a material reality. Historically, when European and European American artists and writers who ventured to tropical zones represented these terrains, their perceptions of the physical arrangements were compounded by projections of values and ideals, as well as certain fears and prejudices. Historian Nancy Lee Stepan reminds us that the word landscape refers to, quote, a manner of perceiving space in terms of a scene situated at a distance from the observer that is rooted in a Western way of organizing the visual field, and that the designation of a site as one of nature often results in our ignoring the social matrices that frame or produce it, or the realities and textures of human activities necessary to make it work as a site of nature, end quote. Indeed, this Western way of perceiving the natural environments of the global South began in the 15th century and persisted well into the 20th century. In his explication of the modernist experience, Edouard Glissant calls for alternative modernisms to be more collective and not singular in their rethinking of these narratives. And he encourages these constructions to embrace the complications that already exist. Quote, they must include all at once struggle, aggressiveness, belonging, lucidity, distrust of self, absolute love, contours of the landscape, emptiness of the cities, victories and confrontations. This is what I call our eruption into modernity, end quote. This line of inquiry speaks to the importance of recognizing a diversity of experiences in modernism, but in particular, the diverse experiences of Black modernism. As Glissant further elucidates, the human spirit yearns for a cross-cultural relationship without universalist transcendence, and diversity requires the presence of people with the intention of creating a new relationship. With this in mind, it is plausible to discern how early 20th century Black Atlantic artists defied conventional understandings of tropicalia by representing tropical terrains in art and performance in new and radical ways. In the vein of art historians such as Corbina Mercer, Laurie Stokes Sims argues that for Black artists, quote, modernism affirmed the notion that a modern individual could be an agent of change or transformation, whereas for white artists, modernism was reflected in the breakdown of the representational and the familiar in literature and art. For Black artists, that rupture represented a potential revolution in self-definition and self-image as they assumed the role of proactive rather than reactive agents in contemporary society. These artists employed what I call tropical aesthetics in an effort to enact the naming of place. Women's studies scholar Catherine McKittrick asserts that such naming, quote, regardless of expressive method and technique, is also a process of self-assertion and humanization, end quote. The tropical aesthetics that these artists and performers use function in this vein, proving to be an aesthetic that makes possible what McKittrick calls a sayability of geography that enables agency. There is no aspiration for material ownership and Black repossession, but rather a grammar of liberation. Tropical aesthetics thus allowed these artists to visually articulate a different way of knowing and imagining the world. Since geography in a material and discursive sense is never fully secure, given that three-dimensional space is socially produced, the idea of belonging to a place could lead to a socio-spatial liberation. Right, the idea that belonging to a place could lead to a social spatial liberation is seldom realized for many Black people, back then and even today. Due to these limitations, tropical aesthetics allows for a critical imagining and reclaiming of space. And through art, one can reify social geographies through the manifestation of what McKittrick calls alternative geographic formulations. Indeed, as the artists and performers explored in tropical aesthetics of Black modernism have proven, art can bring into fruition a different sense of place. Even though Aaron Douglas did not spend considerable time in the tropics beyond his visits to the Caribbean in 1938, and in Haiti specifically in 1938, and Africa in 1956, it would be historically short-sighted not to consider the innumerable meditations and tropicalia in the arts that he would have been privy to while living in Harlem in the 1920s and 30s. And many works in these various disciplines featured ruminations on tropicalia. There was a fecundity of tropicalia in the novels Cane by Jean Toomer, Tropic Death by Eric Walrand, Banana Bottom by Claude McKay, and Porgy by DuBois Hayward. Douglas was also very close to McKay, who was originally from Jamaica, and from whom he would have garnered accounts of the Black experience in this tropical region of the Black Atlantic. There were also the theater productions of Voodoo Macbeth of 1936 and Haiti of 1938 in New York City, as well as Josephine Baker, who evoked tropicality in her early 20th century performances in Paris. Douglas would have most likely seen her while studying in Paris in the 1930s. Like these aforementioned creative endeavors, the tropical landscape in Douglas's work linked the diaspora to Africa, demonstrating how his tropicalia is symbolic of the possibilities and promise of Pan-Africanism. These evocations of tropicalia also make an aesthetic leap across centuries, underscoring Douglas's conviction that his, quote, task was to fabricate such patterns as might have been conceived by Negro artists of antebellum days, end quote. For him, the labor of African Americans in the United States that began during slavery ought not to be overlooked, since it is, quote, one of the most important aspects of our development. We should be proud of it. That part of our lives has gone into the building of America, not only of ourselves, end quote. Although the portrayal of urbanity was intrinsic to Aaron Douglas's creative mission, the depiction of foliage seems to also bear the same weight, given its abundance in much of his works. However, very little attention has been given to the purpose and significance of the vegetation that proliferates these compositions. Works from the advent of his career, such as the Emperor Jones series of 1926, to later pieces like Lagos, Nigeria of 1956, feature stylized and graphically rendered depictions of greenery. While it is debatable whether or not all of the foliage represented in each work is tropical, Since the paintings are often set in either the United States, Africa, or the Caribbean, what is for certain is that tropical flora, such as banana trees, are identifiable in some. It is clear that Douglas's numerous representations of the landscape of the early 20th century intersect with the social, economic, and political aspirations of African Americans had envisioned for themselves. Certainly, visual art gave African Americans the opportunity to imagine their worlds. Leaders of the Pan-Africanism movement championed the cause for improving the well-being of people of African descent around the world. The more radical thinkers of the movement imagined the possibilities of political autonomy and self-governance. No other country epitomized this ideal like Haiti. The Black Republic gained independence from France in the early 19th century after the successful revolution led by Toussaint Louverture, and until the 1950s, it was the only independent Black nation. For people who identified with the ethos of Pan-Africanism, Haiti became a central focus. This is revealed in a mural Douglas created commemorating the Haitian terrain. Douglas painted the Haitian mural for the home of Grace Goins in Wilmington, Delaware, in 1942. The composition features a lush tropical landscape replete with a variety of flora, including a number of banana trees. The artist's signature concentric circles, along with 5 tree branches, lead the eye to a woman sitting on the back of a donkey. Following her are 3 other women with large baskets of produce on their heads. Just a few steps ahead, a man is using a machete to clear their path through the thick vegetation. While it is clear Douglas is celebrating the Black masses of Haiti, his inclusion of these Black market women is not unique in the representation of Caribbean tropical landscapes, since, as art historian Krista Thompson notes, this figure has been the visual companion of tropical nature as early as the late 19th century. Such depictions of Black market women balancing fresh produce on the crowns of their heads completed the visualization of the constructed tropical environment. While there are also 2 men in the mural, their marginal positioning does not grant them the same import. The second man can be seen near the second set of concentric circles in the lower left region of the composition. Here, a sculptural form, I don't know if there's a light, but yeah, the sculptural form is right here. The sculptural form is highlighted with the man playing a large drum in its direction. And here he is. The sculptural figure is similar to the one seen in The Negro in an African Setting from Douglas's Aspects of Negro Life series at the Schomburg Center for Black Art Culture in Harlem. And that's, of course, the New York Public Library's Harlem branch. So this dialogic gesture not only visually parallels the 2 compositions, but it also establishes Haiti as an extension of Africa that is in close proximity to the United States. Douglas's inclusion of the figure reflects a certain adherence to primitivism, which was the case for a number of visual artists of the New Negro movement. By subscribing to this discourse so prevalent in European modern art and culture, Douglas aims to highlight the cultural differences between Haitians and Black Americans. At the same time, the presence of the sculptural figure serves as a symbolic register of Haiti's centrality in Pan-Africanist thought. Symbolism is also present in the architectural structure situated on a hill. The structure may reference La Citadelle, the mountaintop fortress built in the early 19th century by Henri Christophe, an important figure in the Haitian Revolution, who eventually proclaimed himself King of Haiti. He built La Citadelle to serve as a stronghold against France if they attempted to reconquer Haiti. Art historian Susan Earle affirms that buildings often depicted in Douglas's works are symbolic of the mind, of expansion and possibilities, notions not often associated with the Black race, and certainly not with Haiti. This is especially telling given that the year Douglas created the Haitian mural, the United States government officially ended its entanglements in Haiti after almost 3 decades of military occupation and an 8-year period of economic supervision. By inserting this structure into the composition, an iconographic pronouncement of Haiti's transformation from a French plantocratic colony to an independent nation is established to reaffirm the possibility of Black sovereignty. Aspirations of Black political autonomy and the complex relationship that Black people have with the terrain they inhabit are evident in the following seminal mural by Douglas. While his From Slavery to Reconstruction, the second panel from the Aspects of Negro Life series, portrays the imaginings of expansion and possibility for the Black working class, its tropicalia also geopolitically links the land of the southern United States to Africa, engendering a means of formulating an identity. From Slavery to Reconstruction simultaneously conveys 2 pivotal events of African American history: slavery and the Reconstruction period. It features Douglas's signature silhouetted human figures that recall ancient Egyptian wall paintings, the concentric circles that aid in highlighting focal points in his paintings, and the artist's monochromatic color palette. Read from right to left, the painting depicts an official reciting the Emancipation Proclamation, see him on the right, and he's reciting it to an elated group whose arms are outstretched above their heads. A trumpeter who stands to the right of the official provides musical accompaniment to the reading of the proclamation. Behind him, a woman offers expressive corporeal movements that seem to echo the sentiment of the man to the left of the official, with the broken chains still attached to his wrists. In the background stands a row of Union soldiers who symmetrically correspond to the second row of soldiers on the left side of the composition. They are less distinct than the first unit, yet their presence visually offsets the Ku Klux Klan members depicted on horseback at the extreme left of the composition. The Klan members are positioned directly behind a group of sharecroppers whose occupation enabled them to earn a primary source of income during the era of Reconstruction. Although a few sharecroppers take heed to the presence of the Klan members, the majority of them listen attentively to a Reconstruction leader telling the men of their rights to vote as he points to the Capitol in the background. Although not the main focus in the painting, the semi-tropical landscape is an important visual and aesthetic component of the composition. Firstly, it may have informed Douglas's selections of the color palette, since the use of green hues is paramount in the organization of the work. The foliage provides a rich tapestry through which the viewer can further understand the painting's Black subjects. The off-white color of the cotton accenting the lower portion of the work serves as an iconic reminder of the significance of this crop in American history, in addition to the legacy of cotton plantations established primarily in the southern United States. One is able to recall that enslaved Africans worked on these cotton plantations and then by African American sharecroppers in the first half of the 20th century. Although they were forced to labor in plantations while in bondage, after the abolition of slavery, many of them chose to continue working on these plantations as sharecroppers, since it was often the only means of earning a living after the Civil War, despite the meager wages. The topography of this American land that Douglass conveyed does not appear to be particularly American, especially with the inclusion of banana leaves at the top right corner of the painting. Due to the relocation of tropical plants throughout various parts of the tropical world via colonialism, the presence of a banana tree in the southern United States demonstrates how interconnected the American mainland is to the Caribbean archipelago. Yet one can associate Douglass's tropical landscape as evocations of the tropical regions of sub-Saharan Africa. For him, Africa was the common thread that connected Black people of all nationalities. And his tropical scenery served as an intermediary that geologically linked the southern United States and the Caribbean to the African continent. Furthermore, Douglass's interest in African art was closely linked to his desire to reach the common man, and his belief that through art, Black people could begin the process of discovering their African roots. Additionally, Douglass's adherence to Marxist ideology is deeply embedded in the celebratory depiction of the men and women of the working class toiling the land, a virtual taking over of the plantation by members of the proletariat. Implicit in this undertaking is a dissociation of the terrain with the legacy of slavery in an effort to reclaim it. The formerly enslaved transitioned from the plantation system to the plot system as a means of self-sufficiency, as well as political and economic autonomy. Yet what emerged was the creation of a folk culture that soon became what literary scholar Sylvia Wynter called a source of guerrilla resistance to the plantation system. An alternative vision of the purpose of nature is at work here, and it is apparent that Douglass wanted to convey the image of a people who desire an alternative to the capitalist order of the land, an alternative modernity that is not monopolizing, but rather egalitarian. With compositional sophistication, Douglass is able to simultaneously portray what Glissant called for, the victories as well as confrontations, a sense of struggle, a desire for belonging, the distrust of self, and even absolute love. Okay, so we're switching gears to Josephine Baker now. So integral to understanding the ways in which tropical aesthetics are present in exoticized performances of the early 20th century is the consideration of how corporeal expressions of Black performers are enduringly connected to the making of space and claiming a kind of geographic sovereignty. Much in the same way cabarets and music halls incorporated what was called jungle decor into their furnishings to invoke the primitive, I argue in this section that Black performers in turn exploited the tropical artifice to ritualistically engender a likeness to Black autonomy on stage or in song. This speaks to an association of the tropics with a homeland to which one belongs. Indeed, how one experiences race and space in the modern world is negotiated by bodies in motion. And in the early 20th century, as Jana Brown asserts, quote, dance was the lexicon reflecting the dialectic process of modern transformation, the modern body continually reinventing itself in and against its environment, at the same time as the environment made its claim upon the body, end quote. Through song and dance, Black performers practice an imperative of the modern era by transforming their predicament not only through self-reinvention, but also through reorienting their relationship with the physical world. The defiant dancing and singing body worked to challenge geographies of domination and its eclipsing of Black women's geographies, functioning against a world that regarded Black populations as ungeographic. This is evident in the acts of Josephine Baker. In particular, it resonates in her performances of the famed La Revue Nègre at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, and later in La Folie du Jour at the Folies Bergère, both in 1920s Paris. Yet the performances were meant to cater to the escapist desires of the sophisticated Parisian that were deep-rooted in colonialist and exoticist indoctrination. These productions followed the precedent of popular shows featured in the cabarets and nightclubs of early 20th century New York City. Baker was discovered by the creator of La Revue Nègre, Carolyn Dudley Reagan, in one such venue, the Plantation Club of Midtown Manhattan. Frequented by after-theater members of the Café Society, like the Cotton Club in Harlem, and we have pictures here of the Cotton Club, the Plantation Club bore a name that intimated the antebellum South. The owners intended for the power structure of that era to be replicated with carefree Black employees catering to every need of the white patrons. Like the featured performances, the decor incorporated furnishings that invoked the primitive and was often referred to as jungle decor. The Cotton Club, for instance, had artificial palm trees, a plantation facade, while the elegant furniture, fixtures, draperies, and tablecloths were reminiscent of the big house on a southern plantation. Explicitly imbricated in these environments are the impressions of the transatlantic slavery which leak into the future, in essence recycling the displacement of difference. While these environments draw from traditional geographic arrangements, one can see how the cabarets and later the music halls of Paris not only simulated the social and racial order of slavery, but also implicated the geography, the landscape, and the spatial arrangements essential for the institution of slavery. Premiering in 1925, with 25 musicians and artists, La Revue Nègre aspired to become the first major vaudeville-style production that truly represented Black expressive cultures around the world. With a lineup that included a melange of cultural offerings ranging from the Dixieland music of the American South to an authentic African performance titled Danse des Sauvages, Dance of the Savages, the intent was to feature a bill that incorporated the many cultural manifestations attributed to Black people. The review consisted of 7 acts: Mississippi Steamboat Race, New York Skyscraper, Louisiana Camp Meeting, Les Strutting Babies, Darky Impressions, Les Pierres qui Parlent, and Charleston Cabaret. And each act stereotypically highlighted a trait often associated with the soul of Black people: idleness, melancholy, religious fervor, and sexual ecstasy. Particularly interesting is the invocation of locality in the names of most of the 7 acts. They are named after places like Louisiana and Charleston that have long histories of slavery and colonialist oppression. And more importantly, in locations that are situated within the tropical and subtropical zones of the world. The set designs, costuming, musical accompaniment, and choreography of the performances all worked in concert to illuminate the supposed inherent linkage between Black bodies and the tropical zone. It is clear in the conceptualization of the review that the idea of the tropics serves to conjure a hot zone, referring to climate, character, sexuality, and even food, which would consolidate the borders of Europeanness and whiteness. The costuming evoked visual markers that codify Black bodies as destitute, indolent, and even impulsive, highly sexual, exoticized beings. Such a tropical-inspired sensibility characterized the jungle-themed jazz performances one would have seen at the clubs, cabarets, and music halls of 1920s Harlem. The Black Mecca of New York became the site of glamorized otherness, where white patrons went to experience the easily exploited fantasy of tropical sensuality and savage release. White trade clubs such as the Plantation Club, the Cotton Club, and Connie's Inn, located in a strip in Harlem, eventually garnered the name Jungle Alley, offering an opportunity to experience an iteration of the jungle without losing white civility. Carolyn Dudley Reagan, the creator of the review, would have been well aware of this trend and would have played a key role in incorporating the concept into La Revue Negre, thereby being instrumental in exporting this cultural phenomenon to Europe. The notion of the tropics as a hot and torrid zone is what the Parisian audience reacted to upon seeing Josephine Baker and the Martinican dancer Jo Alex to perform their act Danse des Sauvages in La Revue Negre. The review's choreographer decided that this nude performance by Josephine would give the production the erotic edge it needed at a climactic moment in the production. And Baker conceded to this request, even though she didn't want to at first, but they convinced her successfully to do it. The sexually charged performance closed the show and featured Baker and Alex in revealing costumes, with Baker wearing a feather miniskirt and feathers on her wrists and ankles. The dance gave emphasis to the hypersexualization prescribed to Black people, with the conveyance of tropical Africa in the various elements of the production, all serving to strengthen this representation. The performance consisted of acrobatic bodily movements with the accompaniment of a polyrhythmic arrangement by the drummer. There were also corporeal expressions akin to the belly dance that featured moves such as the shake, the shimmy, the mess around, popular dances of the jazz age in 1920s New York. All in all, it is impossible not to recognize the allusions to the jungle that characterize the conceptualization of Blackness in the Western imaginary of the early 20th century. And Baker's contrasting public image off the stage undoubtedly signifies an embodiment of Black modernity. And when she incorporated the opposing sides of her image into her act, this thwarted any possibilities of audience misconceptions. Remnants of her offstage persona are evident on the cover of the La Folie du Jour album from 1926, and this, of course, is from the Wilsonians collection. A gleaming Baker is pictured with her hair coiffed in her signature hairstyle and decked in chandelier earrings, an elaborate pearl necklace, and bracelets. While she is bare-chested, which was typical of Folie Bergère female performers of the time, regardless of race, her costume primarily consists of large aqua blue feather plumes. This image captures the Black modernity inherent in her oeuvre. Not to mention, it exhibits how adept she was in fitting the calculated incongruity between her two sides into her act to maximize its exposure. Since the enterprise of constructing Baker's imagery as a tropicalized other was rooted in a specific geographic location, which is entrenched in France's long-standing involvement in slavery and colonialism, costumes such as the famed banana skirts certainly emblematized tropicality. Originally conceived by the French writer Jean Cocteau, two writers, Jean Cocteau and Paul Collet, Baker first wore the skirt early in her career, starting in the production La Folie du Jour in 1926 at the Folies Bergère, and appeared in other iterations of it over the next 10 years. Folies Bergère offered its patrons escapist spectacles deeply ensconced in Orientalist forms of exotica, and the lavish extravaganzas were accented by extravagant decor of North African derivation that included luxuriant green plants and even a Turkish bath. The set for La Folie du Jour consisted of a dramatic view of thick tropical foliage with a large uprooted tree overrun with vines and moss, taking up much of the middle ground as it is lying on its side. A small portrayal of Baker can be seen playfully running along the tree's trunk, but also trying to avoid falling into the body of water that flows beneath it. Just along the top foreground of the image are detailed renderings of leaves of various tropical plants, conveyed in such a way so as to extend the facsimile of Tropicalia onto the stage. The tone of the colors is quite dark, and it mirrors the dark colors used to render the other human figures depicted in the lower foreground of the image. 7 figures could be seen either sitting or reclining on the ground, 6 of them of African descent looking straight toward the viewer, while the lone white male figure wearing a pith helmet appears to be sleeping in a makeshift open tent. This vista not only exemplifies French colonial conquest in Africa, but it also characterizes the future colonial subjects as complicit to the colonialist project. The jungle spectacle of La Folie du Jour began with 2 black male drummers decked in loincloths positioned underneath a palm tree. While beating their drums, Baker slowly reveals each limb and eventually her torso as she descends from a tree. She then proceeds to present her erotic repertoire of movements in a performance that actively engages with the backdrop just discussed. In the second act, she wore gold bracelets, beaded necklaces, and a collection of realistic-looking bananas fastened around a waistband. She then performed popular dances like the Charleston and the Black Bottom. The emphasis, however, lay on undulating pelvic movements, and as Baker explained, the banana skirt, quote, slung low around my hips to accentuate my forward and backward movements, end quote. Although the multiple phalli of the skirt at once signify the dichotomy of the effeminization of the black male through castration, and alternatively his inherent hypermasculinization, her performance successfully emphasizes an appropriation of masculinity while also challenging heteronormativity. One can even recognize the artistic cannibalism inherent in Baker's performance. In addition, Baker's black body, accentuated by the banana skirt, provides an example of the tropics biting back through the disruption of the power dynamics at play. Rather than accept the pejorative value assigned to tropicality by European thought, tropical aesthetics allows us to think differently about how Baker exercised artistic cannibalism in an effort to consume the reductive significations, such as disparaging the tropicalist landscape and its association with the fetishized black body. Her performances could be viewed as fully engaged in recontextualizing these values in a way that is transformative, since it turns the colonial and imperialist logic of the fetishized black body on its head. Furthermore, when considering the set design for La Folie du Jour, one can acknowledge how this replicated terrain conjures the idea of Africa as a homeland that connected Black people of all nationalities, like those living in Paris, and signifies the possibility of Black sovereignty. This surreptitious ode to Africa reinstates the truth that all African-descended people in and out of the continent persistently engage in modern life. The popular dances Baker sampled during her performances proved to be just as effective in demystifying the Black body's relation with tropical and subtropical landscapes. Most, if not all, of the popular dances that Baker appropriated in her performances were rooted in the long-standing tradition during the 18th and 19th centuries of enslaved African Americans parodying the music and dancing of their white masters. An immensely popular dance in France, the cakewalk was originally a plantation harvest dance that combined the European quadrille with strutting imitations of the planters' class. The Charleston lampooned the square dances of the planters' class, in addition to Africanizing and reconceptualizing the quadrille. What is fascinating about this early 20th century popular dance is that it is named after a city that was the epicenter for the American institution of slavery. As literary scholar Michael Burschuk argues, in the spirit of slaves parodying the dances and actions of their masters, the Charleston does not highlight the, quote, failure for the Black performer to emulate the innate grace of whites, but rather the performer's movements instead exaggerate white sophistication itself as affected as well instead of inherent, end quote. Josephine Baker continued this tradition in her performances by expanding on the parodying of white affectations that ultimately called into question the notion of white superiority. Indeed, the transformation of the French music hall into the ungeographic domain of the jungle via the sound of jazz music, the jungle imagery of the set design, and the frenzied dancing of Black performers all worked in concert to bring into fruition the world of a mythic Black primitivism. Every night, the music hall des Champs-Élysées essentially became a simulated version of the imagined primitivist Africa and the southern United States. There is something carnivalesque and parodying about these jungle spectacles, especially since Paris was a Black transnation all its own. While performers adhere to the desired misrepresentations of Blackness that white audiences wanted to see, after curtain call, they would go to neighborhoods like Montmartre and Montparnasse, where Black modernity was fully practiced and embodied. By the 1920s, the number of Black entertainers traveling from the US increased significantly, and there were also performers coming from the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa. The works of Aaron Douglas undoubtedly express the notion that landscape becomes a metaphor for cultural identity. The landscapes in his works have a new signification, a different function. Historically, the Black community's relationship with the land was threatened as a result of alienation, yet at the same time, as Edward Glissant asserts, this relationship, quote, becomes so fundamental in this discourse that landscape in the work stops being merely decorative or supportive and emerges as a full character, end quote. The landscape is inseparable from the community and the individual in the process of creating history, as well as the construction of identity. Similarly, through ritualized embodiments of tropicalia, Josephine Baker's dynamic and provocative bodily expressions generated the symbolic sovereignty of Pan-Africa, an affinity many early 20th century Blacks necessitated. Indeed, Baker performed constructions of Blackness and Black otherness that she did not ultimately control. Such conundrums in the experience of early 20th century Black performers are constant reminders that, as Stephanie Lee Batiste asserts, quote, Ideologies of power rooted in hierarchy and racism can at times coexist with agendas to assert racial equality and Black humanity, even as the very terms of representations insist upon the opposite." End quote. Ultimately, shifts inevitably occurred in the way Black people molded their identities, insisting that one developed a strong sense of place in this endeavor. Thank you.